In the year 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard, the powerful Viking king of both Norway and Denmark, invaded England and usurped the throne of King Æthelred. Sweyn led a huge force of Danish and Norse raiders, many of whom were still pagan warriors who worshipped the pantheon of Norse gods. Upon Sweyn's death later that year, however, Ethelred, despite being remembered as the unready, meaning bad counsel, was invited back to reclaim the throne of England. Sweyn's young son, Cnut, had other ideas, and amassed himself a large army out of the ashes of his fathers, and launched his own invasion. England was in turmoil, for the first time since the time of the Great Heathen Army, well over 100 years before, during the time of Æthelred's ancestor Alfred the Great. The very survival of England hung in the balance against an onslaught of Vikings, this time led by a king. Now, in 1013, England had no great defender such as Alfred. Æthelred was renowned as being a weak ruler. He was ruthless, but he was indecisive and pursued a policy of appeasement rather than organising a decisive campaign against the invaders. Æthelred died in 1016, and a very different man, his young son, Edmund, seized the throne for himself. It was Edmund who would assemble an English force to push back the Vikings to the sea. Edmund was a warrior prince. He had spent much of his life upon the battlefield, and amassed a small fortune of weapons and armour in the process, most notably wielding a great longsword once possessed by Offa, the revered Anglo-Saxon king of Mercia from centuries before. After securing the throne of Wessex after defeating the English elite who had sided with Cnut after Æthelred's death, Edmund pushed forward, defeating Cnut time and time again, relieving the siege of London, before finally meeting him for one last decisive battle at Assendon. In the years to follow, Edmund would be remembered under a very different title to his father. He was given a name which reflected his valour in battle and his courage: Edmund Ironside. Edmund's exact year of birth is unknown, but it was certainly no later than 993 when his name first begins to appear in official charters, along with that of his two elder brothers. Edmund was the third of 6 sons of Ethelred with his first wife, Ælfgifu of Northumbria, and as such had likely never expected to be king himself. Nevertheless, he was considered an atheling, a prince with a potential claim to the throne. Little is known of the eldest brother, Egbert, who died in 1005, but the second brother, Æthelstan, and Edmund were close. They were both warrior princes and leaders of men. After their mother died in around 1000, Ethelred remarried, this time to Emma of Normandy, who would have 3 more children by him, Alfred, Goda, and Edward, who would later be called the Confessor. By all accounts, Ethelred had been a terrible king. He had come to the throne in 978 as a 12-year-old boy, after the murder of his half-brother, Edward the Martyr, by ambitious members of his own court. Although likely not directly involved himself in this episode, it certainly cast a shadow over his reign, and made it more difficult to gather support against renewed military raids by the Danes. From 991 onwards, Æthelred began to pay tribute, or Danegeld, to the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard to force him out of his lands. Seemingly, Æthelred refused to, or was simply incapable due to lacklustre support, of meeting the Danes in battle, and as a result, more and more Vikings flocked behind Sweyn to extract tribute or simply raid throughout England themselves. In 1002, in one of the grisliest episodes of the Anglo-Saxon period, Æthelred ordered the deaths of every Dane living in his lands. Men, women and children were all ordered to be killed. Of course, this was impossible to carry out in many areas where substantial integration had occurred, but it certainly did happen in some. Stories abounded of Danes taking refuge inside churches, subsequently all being burned to death en masse. Many of the Danes had been settled in England for well over 150 years by this point, and rumour even has it that Sweyn's own sister was killed in the massacre. As a result, he certainly picked up his raids at this point, making it his mission to kill Æthelred and take his kingdom from him. Sweyn finally accomplished this in 1014 when he launched his definitive invasion. It's likely that the warrior princes Edmund and Æthelstan fought against the Danes along with an English army, but they could do little as Sweyn succeeded in taking the whole country. He died soon afterwards, however, but his young son, Cnut, hoped to take the throne in his place. The English lords had other ideas and sent for Æthelred to return from his exile in Normandy, which he did, and he ruled for another 2 years, again in an indecisive and poor manner, allowing Cnut to rampage around the country, raiding at will. The young Æthelstan also died, but Edmund continued to resist the Danes wherever he could. Whoever controlled London controlled the power, and Cnut had not managed to take it yet. Finally, when Æthelred died in April 1016, the Witan of Wessex had had enough of war and decided to choose Cnut as king. Edmund was outraged, and even before Æthelred's death, he may have been on the verge of rebellion. He certainly did rise up at this point and amassed a small army through his own sheer force of will. At June, he won his first victory at Penselwood in central Wessex against the traitorous lords who had sided with Cnut. He then pushed north to Schurston to defeat an army of Danes supported by local English leaders, including Eadric, the Lord of Mercia. He won a great victory there, and again pushed eastwards, gathering more and more men to his banner with each day. He kept north of the Thames and marched on London to relieve Cnut's siege, going on to fight several more battles, pushing Cnut all the way to the Isle of Sheppey in Kent, a traditional stronghold of Viking raiders where Cnut's fleet awaited him. At this stage, Edmund was joined by many English leaders, including some who had previously sided with Cnut, such as Eadric of Mercia. Cnut then pushed out to sea and landed north in Essex, where finally Edmund engaged him in what would be the final battle of the conflict. The Battle of Assendon was fought on the 18th of October between the two armies. At dawn, the English moved forward in three large contingents: East Angles, Mercians and West Saxons. Cnut advanced also, and the shield walls crashed into one another in the centre of the field. The battle lasted for hours as each side had tried to overcome the other. Then Eadric did what Edmund had feared most all along. He turned with his men and he fled the field, thus betraying his liege lord and allowing Cnut to triumph over the now outnumbered and outmanoeuvred West Saxons. There is even some speculation that Eadric had planned to do this all along. Nevertheless, Edmund fought on bravely until nightfall upon a hilltop, before finally withdrawing back to Wessex. A deal was struck, similar to the deal Alfred had made with the Great Heathen Army over 130 years before. Wessex would remain in Edmund's hands, whereas the rest of the kingdom would go to the Danes. Later that year, however, Edmund was dead and the kingdom of Wessex had been taken by Cnut. Foul play was never ruled out, although no one was ever held responsible. Cnut became the king of England, Denmark and Norway, establishing a North Atlantic empire, and eventually being remembered as the Great. Cnut proved to be a far better king than Æthelred ever was. He kept intact the existing Anglo-Saxon infrastructure and brought many Anglo-Saxon leaders onto his side, most notably the Earl Godwin, who became one of his most trusted advisors, and the Earl of Wessex. His sons, Harold and Tostig, would go on to become influential leaders in their own right over the next decades. A decade after the events of Assendon in 1016, Cnut visited the grave of Edmund to pay his respects to the man who was arguably his most worthy adversary. After Cnut's death in 1035, and the deaths of his sons Harold and Arthur Cnut, Edward the Confessor, the son of Æthelred by Emma of Normandy, would return from his exile and inherit the throne. Edward was childless, however, and upon his death in 1066, William, another relative of his mother Emma, would join Harold, the son of Godwin, in fatefully staking a claim to the English throne.